Before the gate guard could even reach for his radio, 31 military working dogs broke formation at once. Handlers shouted commands that nobody obeyed. Leashes went tight, then slack, then tight again as the dogs dragged grown men across wet gravel toward a woman in a faded blue cardigan who hadn't even gotten through the front gate. Nobody on that base had an explanation. Nobody would have one for weeks. All they knew, in that first frozen second, was that something about her had reached every single working dog on a secured military installation, and none of them were letting her leave. The town of Cedar Hollow sat in a fold of the Virginia mountains, close enough to Fort Bellman that the rumble of transport trucks was just part of the weather. Most people there had some thread tying them to the base, a husband, a son, a paycheck. Margaret Voss had threads running through all of it, though by the time this story starts, most of those threads had already been cut. She was 66 years old, and for 31 of those years, she had worked as a combat trauma nurse. First overseas in field hospitals that smelled permanently of diesel and antiseptic, and later, after her body couldn't keep up with deployments anymore, in the base hospital at Fort Bellman itself. She'd stitched, splintered, and sat beside more young soldiers than she could count, in rooms with no windows, on nights when the radio said one thing and the silence said another. Nobody at the base remembered her now. That's the part that mattered. 8 years had passed since she retired, and retirement, for a woman like Margaret, had not been kind. She lived alone in a single-story house at the edge of town, the kind with a sagging porch and a mailbox that leaned a little more every winter. Her husband, Daniel, had been Army too, infantry, 2 tours, home in body, but never quite all the way home in mind. He'd passed 4 years ago, quietly, in his sleep, after a decade of nightmares that Margaret had learned to recognize by the sound of his breathing alone. Their son, Caleb, had followed his father's path into the service. He'd died in a training accident overseas, the kind of death the Army apologizes for in a folded flag, and very little else. So Margaret had buried a husband and a son who had both worn the same uniform she'd spent her whole life patching back together. And somewhere in the middle of all that grief, the people who once called her ma'am, with real respect, simply stopped calling at all. She still walked to the edge of town some mornings just to watch the convoy trucks roll past the tree line. She still kept her old hospital ID in a drawer, laminated edges curling, photo faded to a ghost of the woman she used to be. She never showed it to anyone. There was no one left to show it to. What none of the young guards on shift that morning understood, what none of them could possibly have known, was that for 6 years straight, before her retirement, Margaret Voss had been the one constant in the recovery ward where wounded military working dogs were brought after combat. Not the soldiers. The dogs, she had not chosen that assignment. The Army had, simply because the regular veterinary staff were stretched too thin and somebody needed to sit with the K9s through the worst of their healing, the same way someone needed to sit with the men. Margaret had volunteered for both, every single time. And dogs, it turns out, remember kindness in a part of the brain that doesn't forget. The morning everything changed started like any other for Margaret. She had a doctor's appointment that morning. Nothing serious. Just hands that had started shaking a little more than they used to, a heart that fluttered when it shouldn't. But on her way back, she'd taken the long route past Fort Bellman's main gate, the way she always did when the ache in her chest got loud enough to need quieting. She liked the sound of the bass, the order of it, the reminder that somewhere men and women were still doing the work her husband and son had given their lives to. She wasn't planning to stop. She never did anymore. But that morning, the gate guard, a young corporal named Diaz, barely 23, new enough to the post that he still checked his clipboard twice, happened to glance up as she walked past on the public sidewalk just outside the fence line, and in the K9 holding yard behind him, visible through the chain link, 31 military working dogs were going through their morning exercise routine, handlers walking them in slow loops around the training field. That's when it happened. One dog stopped first. A Belgian Malinois named Axel, mid-stride, ears snapping forward like something had fired a gun nobody else could hear. His handler tugged the lead, confused, and Axel didn't budge. He stared through the fence, directly at the woman in the blue cardigan 60 yards away, and let out a single, sharp bark that cut through the morning air like a flare going up. Then a second dog stopped. Then a third. Within 10 seconds, every single working dog on that training field had turned, frozen, and fixed their eyes on the same spot along the fence line. Corporal Diaz didn't know what he was looking at. He just knew it was wrong, in the way that anything unexplainable on a secured base is wrong. He keyed his radio. Possible perimeter alert, K9 field, all units behave erratic, repeat, all units. But erratic wasn't the right word, and somewhere deep down, even Diaz knew it. Erratic was barking at nothing, snapping at shadows, the kind of thing dogs do when training goes sideways. This wasn't that. This was 31 dogs straining toward one woman like she was the only solid thing in the world. Margaret had stopped walking the moment she heard the first bark. She didn't know why. Some old instinct from years of working around military dogs told her that a sound like that meant something, even from 60 yards and behind a fence. She turned to look, and for a moment she simply stood there, hand pressed flat against her chest, the way she always did now when her heart did something it shouldn't. She didn't recognize any of them. Not at that distance, not after 8 years. But something in her chest had gone tight and warm at the same time, the way it used to, when she walked into the recovery ward at 6 in the morning and a row of bandaged, exhausted dogs would lift their heads just because they knew her footsteps. She didn't move closer. She didn't think she had the right to. That was when the handlers lost control entirely. Axel broke first, yanking his handler nearly off his feet, dragging the young soldier 4 full strides toward the fence before the man dug his boots in and held the line. Then a German shepherd named Tank did the same thing from the opposite end of the field. And within moments, it wasn't a training exercise anymore. It was 8 handlers fighting 8 separate leashes, all of them straining in the exact same direction, toward the exact same 60-year-old woman standing quietly on a public sidewalk. "What in the hell is going on out there?" came a voice over the radio, sharp with the particular irritation of someone who outranked everyone listening. That voice belonged to Master Sergeant Renata Cole, the senior K9 handler on base, a woman who had spent 11 years working military dogs and had never, not once, seen anything like what she was watching through the chain-link fence. She arrived at a flat run, boots skidding slightly on the gravel, and the scene she found stopped her cold. 8 trained military working dogs, hardened, disciplined animals worth more in specialized training than most cars, were ignoring every command they'd ever been taught. They weren't aggressive, they weren't afraid. They were straining toward a stranger with an intensity that looked, more than anything else, like grief finally finding its way home. "Stand down, all handlers, hold positions," Cole barked, though even as she said it, she wasn't sure what she was asking them to hold against. She walked to the fence line herself, scanning past it to the sidewalk, to the woman in the blue cardigan who was now standing very still, both hands pressed to her mouth. Watching the dogs with an expression Cole couldn't quite name, it wasn't surprise. It looked almost like recognition. "Ma'am," Cole called through the fence, keeping her voice level despite the chaos behind her. "Can I ask who you are?" Margaret's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but it carried. "My name is Margaret Voss," she said. "I used to work here." That sentence would have meant nothing to Sergeant Cole on any other day. But the way Axel was still straining at his lead, the way every single dog on that field had turned toward this one stranger like. She was the answer to a question none of them could put into words. That sentence suddenly felt like the smallest piece of something enormous. What none of them knew yet, what would take days to fully surface, was that Margaret Voss hadn't just worked at Fort Bellman. For 6 years, she had been the unofficial heart of the K9 recovery ward, the one constant face that greeted nearly every working dog that came back from deployment wounded, broken, or simply too traumatized to function. Military working dogs don't get the same homecoming soldiers do. There's no parade. There's no family waiting at the gate. There's a kennel, a vet tech rotation, and if the dog is very lucky, a handler who actually shows up to visit during recovery. For dogs who came back from explosive detection work with shrapnel wounds, or patrol dogs who'd been shot covering their handlers, or detection K9s who simply couldn't stop shaking after what they'd seen and smelled overseas, there was often nobody except Margaret. She had started visiting the kennel almost by accident. Back when her own son was still alive and deployed. Back when, sitting with a frightened dog at 3 a.m, felt like the only thing keeping her sane while she waited for news that never came on her schedule. She'd bring blankets from home. She'd sit on the cold concrete floor of a kennel run, for hours sometimes, simply talking in a low, steady voice to dogs who flinched at every sudden sound. She learned, slowly, the things nobody had bothered to teach the rotating vet staff, which dogs needed silence, which needed constant low talking, which dogs would only eat if someone sat with them, which dogs needed to be touched gently on the shoulder before they could be touched anywhere else. She memorized scars. She memorized names. She memorized, in a way that had nothing to do with paperwork, which dog had survived which deployment and what it had cost them. Axel had come through her ward 4 years before her retirement. 18 months old and barely recovered from a roadside explosion that killed his first handler and left Axel himself with hearing loss in one ear and a fear of loud engines that took nearly a year to work through. Margaret had sat with him every single night for 3 weeks straight, simply being present, simply being calm, until the dog finally stopped flinching every time a door slammed somewhere in the building. Tank had come through wounded and half-starved after a deployment that ended badly enough that nobody on his old team liked to talk about it. Margaret had hand-fed him for 9 days before he trusted anyone enough to eat on his own. There were others on that field too, a Malinois named Scout, a shepherd named Duke. Dogs whose names had changed since Margaret's time, but whose bodies and instincts had not forgotten a single hour she'd spent with them. She had never asked for recognition for any of it. It wasn't in her file. It wasn't the kind of thing that earns a medal or a mention in a retirement ceremony. She had simply done it because somebody needed to, and because, if she was honest with herself, those dogs had kept her steady through some of the worst years of her life, every bit as much as she had kept them steady through theirs. When she retired, there had been no formal goodbye to the kennel. Budget cuts had already begun shuffling staff around, and by the time Margaret cleaned out her locker, half the dogs she'd cared for had already been reassigned or retired themselves. She'd simply walked out one day and never come back, certain that whatever bond she'd built had been replaced, the way everything on a base eventually gets replaced. She had no idea that dogs don't replace bonds the way people do. Sergeant Cole made the call that brought Margaret through the gate 20 minutes later, not as a security matter, but as what she would later describe to her commanding officer as an operational necessity, because by that point 3 more dogs from the kennel building, dogs that hadn't even been outside, had started barking in a rhythm that the kennel master swore sounded almost like distress. When Margaret stepped through the gate, visitor badge clipped awkwardly to her cardigan, Axel didn't wait for permission. He surged forward the moment his handler loosened the lead even slightly, and Margaret dropped to her knees on the gravel without a single thought for her own joints or balance. Arms already open, the dog hit her like a wave, nearly knocking her backward, burying his head against her shoulder with a whine that several of the watching soldiers would later admit brought tears to their eyes, without quite understanding why. Margaret wrapped both arms around his thick neck and pressed her face into his fur, and for a moment neither of them moved, 2 creatures who had once kept each other steady through the worst of it. Finding each other again after 8 years neither one of them had chosen. "Hello, sweet boy," she whispered, voice cracking. "Look at you. Look how strong you got." Tank was next, then Scout, then Duke, until Margaret was kneeling in the middle of the training field, surrounded by dogs who had once been broken and frightened, and were now pressing against her from every side, tails low and steady. The universal K9 signal, not of excitement, but of relief. Sergeant Cole stood at the edge of that circle with her arms crossed, watching 11 years of training protocol get quietly dismantled by something far older and far simpler than any command she'd ever issued. She wasn't angry. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that her throat had gone tight. "Ma'am," she said finally, crouching down near Margaret, "I need to understand what I'm looking at here." Margaret looked up at her, eyes wet, one hand still resting on Axel's scarred shoulder. "I used to sit with them," she said simply, "when they came back hurt. Nobody else had time. I had time." It was the kind of answer that explained everything and nothing at all, and Cole understood, somehow, that the rest of the explanation would take a lot longer than a few sentences on a gravel training field. If this kind of story, quiet service, real loyalty, and the bonds nobody puts in the official record, means something to you, take a moment to subscribe. These are exactly the kinds of stories that deserve to be remembered, especially for the people who never asked to be. Word of what had happened on the training field moved through Fort Bellman the way these things always do, fast and slightly wrong in every retelling. By that afternoon, half the base had heard some version of a stray civilian got attacked by the K9 unit, and the other half had heard a former nurse got mobbed by half the kennel like she was a long-lost relative, which was considerably closer to the truth, though it still missed the heart of it. Captain Elena Marsh, the base's public affairs liaison, got the real version from Sergeant Cole directly, and immediately understood 2 things. First, that there was no actual security incident to report. Second, that whatever this was, it deserved a closer look that had nothing to do with public relations and everything to do with simple human curiosity. She arranged for Margaret to come back 2 days later, this time through the front office rather than the gate, with proper coordination so nobody mistook the visit for an emergency. Margaret almost said no. She told Captain Marsh on the phone that she didn't want to make a fuss, that whatever happened at the gate was just dogs being dogs, nothing worth anyone's time. "Ma'am," Marsh said gently, with respect, "I don't think any of us have ever seen dogs being dogs look like that." Margaret came back on a Thursday morning, and this time the visit was arranged properly. Sergeant Cole present, the kennel master present, even the base veterinarian, a quiet, thoughtful man named Dr. Whitfield, who had been trying for 2 days to find a clinical explanation for what he'd witnessed and kept coming up short. What happened that morning answered some questions and raised 100 more. Margaret walked the length of the kennel building slowly, one hand trailing along the chain link of each run, and dog after dog rose to meet her hand before she'd even said a word. Some she remembered instantly by name, despite the passage of years. "Hello, Bishop. Look how grey you've gotten around that muzzle." And some she studied for a long moment before the memory surfaced, a particular scar, a particular way of holding an ear, before she said softly, "Oh, Penny, it's you." Dr. Whitfield walked beside her with a clipboard he never once used. He didn't need it. What he was watching wasn't something you could measure with charts. "These dogs have been through multiple handler reassignments," he said quietly to Cole, trailing a few steps behind. "Some of them have had 3 or 4 handlers since she would have known them. Dogs don't typically hold a memory bond that long, not with this kind of intensity, not after this many transitions." "Then how do you explain it?" Cole asked. Whitfield watched Margaret crouch in front of a kennel run, where an older shepherd named Bishop pressed his greying muzzle through the gap in the fence to lick her wrist, his whole body trembling with something that looked unmistakably like joy. "I don't think I can," Whitfield admitted. "I think whatever she gave these dogs went in deeper than training does. I think it went in the same place fear does, and fear doesn't fade just because time passes. Maybe comfort doesn't either." It was on that second visit that the deeper truth of Margaret's life started surfacing, not because she offered it, but because Sergeant Cole, sitting with her afterward over coffee in the break room, asked the simple question that had been bothering her since the gate. "Why did you stop coming?" Cole asked. "After you retired, I mean. You clearly meant something to every single one of these animals. Why disappear?" Margaret wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and was quiet for a long moment. "Because I didn't think anyone would want an old woman hanging around a working military kennel for no reason," she said finally. "And because, around the same time I retired, I lost my son. And then, a few years after that, my husband. And I suppose, somewhere in there, I stopped believing I had anything left to offer anybody, including the dogs." Cole set her own coffee down slowly. "Your son served, Caleb." Margaret's voice was steady, the way voices get steady only after years of practicing not breaking in front of strangers. "He died in a training accident 3 years into his enlistment. My husband Daniel was infantry, 2 tours, and the war never really let go of him even after he came home. He passed 4 years ago, in his sleep, which I suppose is its own kind of mercy, though it didn't feel that way at the time." Nobody at the table said anything for a moment. Outside the window, the sound of dogs working through a training exercise drifted faintly across the yard. "I used to tell myself," Margaret continued, "that sitting with those dogs in recovery was the closest I could get to sitting with my own boy when he was scared and far from home, and I couldn't be there. I know that probably sounds strange." "It doesn't," Cole said quietly. "It sounds like the most honest thing anyone said to me all week." What Cole didn't say, not yet, was that she had already started pulling old personnel files. The kind of quiet inquiry a senior NCO can make, without anyone above her noticing right away. She wanted to understand exactly how deep Margaret's service to that kennel had actually gone, because the more she learned, the more it seemed like something the army itself had never properly acknowledged. What Cole found, over the following week, was a record buried in old maintenance logs, and informal duty rosters rather than any official commendation file. Because the work Margaret had done had never been formally assigned to her in the first place. She had simply shown up, night after night, year after year, doing a job nobody had thought to create a position for. The numbers, once Cole started adding them, were staggering. Over 6 years, Margaret Voss had logged unofficial overnight hours with no fewer than 41 different military working dogs going through post-deployment recovery, trauma rehabilitation, or simple medical convalescence. Several of those dogs had gone on to complete full additional service careers after recovery that veterinary staff at the time had genuinely doubted were possible. One name stopped Cole cold when she found it cross-referenced in an old incident report. A Malinois named Diesel, who, according to the file, had come back from an overseas deployment so severely traumatized by an ambush that the original recommendation had been euthanasia on the grounds that the dog was too dangerous and too broken to ever be safely handled again. The file noted in clipped official language that a civilian staff nurse had requested and been granted 30 days to attempt behavioral stabilization before any final decision was made. The nurse's name, typed in flat, unremarkable font, was M. Voss. Diesel had not only survived those 30 days. According to the record, he'd gone on to serve 4 more years before retiring naturally, old age, rather than instability, finally taking him out of service. Cole sat with that file open on her desk for a long time before she picked up the phone and called Captain Marsh. "I think," Cole said carefully, "we need to talk to someone above both our pay grades about this." The base commander, Colonel James Otero, was not a man known for sentiment. 26 years of service had worn most of the softness out of him, or so the junior officers liked to joke behind his back. But when Cole laid out the file on Diesel, along with 3 other similar cases she'd uncovered in the following days, dogs marked for retirement or worse, stabilized instead under Margaret's quiet, unofficial care. Otero read through all of it twice without saying a word. She was never compensated for any of this, he finally said. It wasn't a question. "No, sir. As far as I can find, this was entirely voluntary. Off the books, every bit of it." Otero closed the file slowly. "And nobody thought to put her up for any kind of recognition at the time?" Cole hesitated. "I think, sir, that the kind of work she did doesn't fit neatly into any award category we have. There's no medal for sitting on a concrete floor at 3 in the morning, so a traumatized dog doesn't feel alone." Otero was quiet for a long moment, looking out his office window toward the kennel yard, where, even from that distance, the faint sound of dogs working could be heard drifting across the grounds. "Then maybe," he said slowly, "it's time we figured out how to make one." What followed over the next several weeks was not the kind of grand sudden justice that makes for an easy story. There was no single ceremony that fixed 8 years of quiet grief overnight. But there was, piece by piece, a recognition that had been missing for far too long. Colonel Otero personally requested Margaret's presence at the base, not as a visitor this time, but as a guest of honor, for a small ceremony held in the training yard where it had all started. He stood in front of assembled handlers, kennel staff, and several dogs straining gently at their leads, and read aloud in a voice that cracked more than once the record sergeant Cole had assembled, the names, the dates, the dogs who were alive and still serving today because one woman had refused to let them feel forgotten when the rest of the world had every intention of doing exactly that. He presented Margaret with a commendation the Army didn't technically have a formal template for, one that Cole and Marsh had spent 2 days drafting from scratch, titled simply, "For extraordinary and sustained compassionate service to military working dogs in recovery." It was, as far as anyone on base could determine, the first of its kind ever issued at Fort Bellman. Margaret stood there in her good coat, the one she usually saved for church, hands trembling slightly as she held the framed commendation, surrounded by dogs who pressed close around her ankles the entire time, refusing to be herded back by their handlers, refusing, even now, to let her stand alone. "I didn't do it for this," she told the gathered crowd, voice thick. "I want that understood. I did it because somebody had to, and because, God help me, those dogs needed somebody just as much as I needed them. My son couldn't come home to me anymore. My husband couldn't always find his way back from where the war had left him. But these dogs," she paused, looking down at Axel, who had pressed his head firmly against her leg, the moment she stopped speaking, "these dogs let me hold on to something. And I suppose, in the end, that's exactly what I was trying to give back to them." There wasn't a dry eye among the assembled soldiers, and more than one hardened handler found a reason to look very intently at the ground. If this story reminds you of someone who served quietly, without recognition, without asking for any of it, someone who simply showed up because it mattered, we'd love to hear about them in the comments. Stories like these deserve to live on far longer than the moment they happened. In the months that followed, Margaret's life looked different in ways she hadn't expected and hadn't quite dared to hope for. Colonel Otero, with Cole's enthusiastic backing, created a formal volunteer liaison position at the kennel, specifically, so Margaret could return on a regular schedule, this time fully recognized, fully welcomed, with her own visitor credentials and a small plaque on the kennel office door that read simply, "Margaret's room," designating the quiet side office where she now sat most mornings with whichever dog needed her most that day. Axel, now permanently assigned to a lighter semi-retired duty rotation due to his hearing loss, became something close to her shadow whenever she was on base, trotting at her heel through the kennel halls like a dog half his age. Dr. Whitfield, still without a fully satisfying, clinical explanation for the bond he'd witnessed, eventually stopped trying to explain it and simply made room for it in his treatment plans, noting more than once in his case files that recovery outcomes improved measurably on days Margaret was present. She started, slowly, to look like a woman who had found her footing again. Not because the grief for Daniel and Caleb had disappeared, because grief like that never fully does, but because she had somewhere to put the love that grief leaves behind with nowhere else to go. Sergeant Cole became, in her own words, an unlikely Thursday morning coffee friend. The two of them sitting in the break room most weeks, talking about everything and nothing, the kind of friendship neither had expected but both had clearly needed, and every so often, usually early in the morning, before the base had fully woken up, soldiers on duty would glance toward the training yard and see an old woman in a worn blue cardigan walking slowly among the dogs, a small crowd of them trailing at her heels like she was the only solid thing in their world. Because, in the way that mattered most, she still was. If this story touched your heart, we'd be honored to have you join us for more stories like it. Stories that celebrate the quiet heroes, the loyal dogs, and the people who never asked for recognition but earned every bit of it anyway. Like this video, share it with someone who'd understand, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Drop a comment below and tell us, has a dog ever remembered you in a way that surprised you? We'd love to hear it.